Hello everyone, welcome to Data Insights. This link is going to cover some of the data points that some of you are responsible to take a further dive into and do some due diligence. I'm going to run through some basic stuff on CreditorWatch. Will be very high end, and the aim after that is once I've sort of covered some of the key points, you guys can ask questions and we can sort of further develop training as we go through things. So hopefully you can see my screen, and I'll just walk through some areas that I think will really add value to how you can search out clients and really gain some insight to how they are. So I'm just going to use an example one, a bad credit file, and that way I can point out information as we go. So as you'll see here with A1 Advanced Constructions, they have obviously hit into external administration. So there's always some really key indicators, and you'll see a number of these clients across the board. And what I'll do is sort of share what early warning signs take place, also how that fits into your daily alerts. And then when you're sourcing out a client, I've got a lot of historical information that I can share, which will really add value to understanding to where this company has got itself to now. So something I really want to cover off is credit inquiries. So we remain anonymous. So we look at credit inquiries as both a positive and negative element of the credit report. So when our credit rating was designed by Open Analytics, these guys came from a banking background, and what they saw with bureaus was that it started off as a demerit system, and you may have seen it using other competitors. People with very low credit activity have a high score, and that score only drops as credit activity gets higher or more involved. They came in and said, hang on a second, in the banking sector, there's both positive and negative things that attach to a file. So back in 2020, we went down that path. There's a lot of information to share, and I'll just touch a little bit on today, and I have some more links to further enrich that data source for you. So credit inquiries remain anonymous. When you jump into a credit file, really, I always educate people to look at the size of the business, the type of business, and then relate credit inquiries to your own personal knowledge. So you could come into a credit file like this. Now, maybe 12 months ago, it didn't have many alert or credit inquiries on it, and that's simply because it would have been an active business. Green ticks, had no issues. As we jump in now, we can see that adverse has hit over time, and particularly since that external administration is hit, that would have boosted up the credit inquiries because those companies watching that particular entity would have received an alert and therefore would have jumped and investigated that particular file. So I always like to point out credit inquiries from the very beginning. You need to obviously understand the entity you're looking at, and then your own understanding of that size business will really dictate whether that's a lot of inquiries or less as we go through. As mentioned in the very first link about the general operations, you know that the AVR and ASIC data sit here, so it's pulling through those government departments directly into our system as part of it. Something that I spend a lot of time with people talking about is their credit rating, and this area is really important because I describe a credit report as a behavioural piece of information. So what I mean by that is the designer of a credit rating, James O'Donnell, he makes a really good point. Says that a credit rating is their behaviour minus the balance sheet. So when looking at, again, at a risk score, you need to take into context the size of the business, the type of sector that it's in. There's a lot of information that comes out of it. So my message is always look at a rating, but you need to look at things behind the rating, which will give you a much better understanding of the entity and sort of the risk that is involved as part of it. We provided previous 12 months summary. So as you can see here with this entity, 12 months ago, they were sitting in a C1 sort of rating, and over time, they've gradually decreased. This is very common. that we see, particularly for middle tier sort of businesses and smaller businesses, where their behaviour starts to reflect probably their financial situation, and we start to see a downslope within that particular entity. We have a scorecard recommendation, but for those who need to dig deeper, I'll be doing training a lot more around this area. And it's really important because some of the factors we share is around how financial, behavioural, demographic risk all play a part in sort of making key decisions around how you deal with an entity, and also who they're related to. So I'd spend a lot of time teaching people about finding the parent companies or the shareholders and really mapping back who's involved with the company. On top of that, we provide a payment rating. So this was a really important aspect that got added after our update to our credit rating. And that's because payment rating in itself tells a whole story. So we've particularly seen out of COVID a real trend where companies start to really exceed days overdue on an upward trend. And what's happened there is that is actually the first sign of issues within the business. So this is a live link that we have with our customers who willingly put in their ATB data, and then also our small to medium customers who use platforms such as Mile and Xero. They're integrated. So we're always getting a live feed. If we have enough unique trade lines from our diverse range of customers, we build a credit rating to show how that's being shown collectively on the market. This might not be your experience, but it could be someone else's. And it goes same for saying when you come in here and perhaps they have a really good payment rating, but your experience with that client could be very different. So we always teach people, you need to really look at this and understand, again, the size of the business, the type of business, and then what we do on top of that is provide some exposure limits that some of these debts are at. Again, I've got more information on it, which will go much more in depth for those who need to know. But a key part is that we don't use payment rating as a key source of insolvency, but it does impact slightly on the credit rating. And what they've done with this split up is to sort of try and balance the two. You may know with some of the big guys, they're actually the worst payers, and that's simply because they hold on to their cash and then pay at the end of the month or longer terms. So that can change the payment rating for someone big, while smaller guys, they could be excellent players but really have a poor rating, and that's because they're trying to get to their suppliers as quickly as they can to pay bills. And one classic area we always see is a medium to small business, okay credit rating, amazing payment rating, but then fall off the cliff with their credit report, with the rating. And what's happened there is potentially they haven't paid the ATO, and that's their biggest debtor, and then that's fallen off as we go through. So a lot of information in that area, and I really think as we've got time to really go through those aspects, you'll really appreciate some of the data that takes place and the algorithms built to predictively behave. So just touching on the credit rating again, our rating is predictively looking at the next 12 months and whether there'll be any potential signs of adverse. Now, it doesn't mean insolvency, it can mean court actions, defaults, just something that may indicate that there's changes happening. And as I mentioned earlier, those gradual changes can start to form your alerts each month as they drop with behavior things starting to hit that credit report. Risk data. So this is an area where I'll touch on briefly, but any court actions and also court summons or writs come through here. It's really key to look at this area because the action determines the outcome. So you will see summons or writs if it's in Queensland, and the default judgment meaning that did actually go to the end. So sometimes you'll come in and see a zero amount, but looking at that means that there was a court proceeding happening, but we're yet to know the outcome. Now, I have spent a number of years with clients talking about this sort of area. Writs and summons can also have different amounts which won't be the end result of the default judgment. And that's simply because the writ's been submitted to court by the plaintiff, and they might have put an extravagant number in there, but by the time the court proceeding's gone through, it's very likely, one, it could have been settled outside of court, so you won't get a default judgment, or two, the default judgment looks very different to what the original case was about. So again, courts are an interesting area, and really the data that comes through here is what I call a lagging indicator. So not only can you look at court actions and payment defaults, our defaults are submitted by CreditorWatch customers. And what happens there is we are always encouraging our customers to lodge defaults, but you may have seen it with using Equifax or even us. Defaults don't tend to happen until after insolvency. What we find is people are a little bit scared to lodge defaults because of the risk of preferential payments. I've got some of my large clients nationally who are petrol companies that also withhold submitting defaults, because if they submit a default, other providers are going to see, hey, they're not paying for their petrol, then that's really going to impact us. So you'll find real small businesses within CreditorWatch start to default early, and that's because a lot of the time they don't have the cash to chase them in the courts. So defaults are really powerful for our small guys, but our small guys tend to trigger the bigger guys who will then start to default on our system as we go through. So what I always say with court actions and defaults is that they are real lagging indicators on the credit report, because the action's already happened. If we're at that stage, there's very likely that issues with that business have been happening for some time. So I really recommend, as you get the chance to explore through our data, look at the historical defaults, you'll start to get better at recognizing behavioral signs before they start to elevate to more serious areas. Now, to touch on defaults, I think this is a really important area. A lot of the clients we have are small to medium-sized businesses, so traditionally they never used a credit bureau. It was too expensive for them. They didn't get the help they needed in terms of understanding what they were paying for with credit reports. So over the past 10 years, CreditorWatch has got a really large amount of commercial customers, and they really embrace the fact that they can lodge defaults. They're not, not in trouble for using that sort of source. Another key indicator, and I'll sort of point the difference between a consumer default and commercial, is that we get a lot of customers who come over from Equifax thinking that they need to follow the consumer rules for a default. In the commercial space, it comes under something completely different. So we educate our customers that as long as it's past your terms, they've got evidence to show that this particular entity hasn't paid them on time, they can lodge a default. Our customers use this page to then take a screenshot, send to that entity and say, hey, default submitted. Or what we find is a lot of our larger customers who use our default data will have a little flag for those that onboard, and it will instantly deny credit. So what happens is our customers find out about us having a default, they'll ring us saying, hey, someone's lodged this against us, and then that sort of gets the ball rolling as part of it. So defaults are really crucial, and in your daily alerts, you'll really get to see the amounts that come through. Another important factor that I like to point out about court actions is that we found a magical number, and it seems to be around that $16,000 mark. So we've found that if a business, again, looking into perspective of that size business, if a business has a $16,000 default judgment against it, it gets into a significantly higher level of going insolvent. So I tend to share those little stats because it's really helpful, again, to sort of predicting the behavior of an entity and whether they're at risk of going insolvent over time. Tax defaults, I'll touch on this a little bit in the very first link, but again, I just want to really point out again that if you get into a file, find a tax default, by all means record it, print the PDF. You really need to just take a snapshot because the ATO has the ability to remove it whenever they like. A few things that come out of that since they went live in July last year, and that is they are large amounts. Now, what we've seen is when a company is really keen to stay solvent, what they tend to do is engage with the ATO, and that's when we've seen the default disappear. So it's actually a really important part because if the default has stayed on, generally we know that they haven't really engaged, or the ATO is trying to flex their muscle a little bit more. So again, tax defaults are going to be crucial. What we can see over the next 12 to 24 months is the ATO getting tougher on debt, and these defaults will start to come up much sooner. That's where you also see within the credit rating where the ATO has and hasn't submitted a default. And what happens is, you know, they might have been traveling along really well. A default from the ATO is hit, they've had a big dip, and then all of a sudden, after 2 months, that company's engaged. Because the ATO removed their default, the algorithm goes back to normal. So when you're looking at a credit report, it can show quite variances in the graph. So what's happening there is that information's coming and going. Remember, it's a live platform. So not only can you take pictures of the PDF, but you'll be able to compare that time over and really understand what's happened with that business. ASIC published notices. So when they do take place, this is where you can come and view that information. But I really want to raise a point about how that information comes through. So ASIC published notices can take longer than the documentation sent into ASIC. And what I mean by that is under a certain area here called ASIC documents, this to me is your lifeline of understanding how a business started and where it's got to today. So a lot of the time, the very first document lodged is the creation of the business. And then as that business over time develops, or new directors come in, changes to addresses happen, it leaves a footprint with ASIC, which we then collect and leave that as a historical step over time. What happens is that sometimes the notification of an external administrator takes place, so the information at ASIC's been submitted by them for the public to see. We capture that, it's part of your alert. But as we know with notifications, there is sometimes a window period where they can dispute that that entry, and it could very likely not even get to insolvency because it could have been resolved. Someone could have come in and acquired the business. So it's really important to keep track of these steps. And then if it does jump to insolvency, then normally this information comes afterwards. So if I point out on this one, it was the 5th of May that notification came through. But if I look at the notification of the receive date, it's the 2nd of May. So really important those 3 days, particularly for the type of clients we have who might have been doing business in that time. So again, as you play around, look at some historical data, you'll really start to map back how those businesses sort of got to where they are, and really help build a story. So again, when you're analyzing someone, you know where it began, where it's got to, and who's involved within the company as part of it. Mercantile inquiries. So this is when our debt collectors who use the platform with CreditorWatch, they've got the option to leave an ASIC footprint. So we see this quite regularly when they want to put a bit of pressure, because the mercantile will impact a credit rating, because it's showing, hey, with someone's got a third party to start chasing this debt, and it's an effective way to almost wake up some of these entities. Critical documents are lodged here. So again, what we do with our alerts is there's so many documents being lodged to ASIC. What we do is we take the most important ones and that builds into the credit file. So a lot of the time, people can go to the ASIC website, but you'll be through mountains of documents lodged. So what we do is grab some of those critical ones, put them into sections of the platform, and it just helps you jump in there and look at that. And you can buy them. So all we do here with the purchase is that you can directly get it from ASIC, and it comes through and gets emailed to you as you go through. So this is an important area I just want to touch on too, for those who want to do a lot more in-depth search and sort of understand how we work. And also, you're coming from Equifax, where you'll be reading off a PDF report. Our section's a little bit more interactive, so you're able to explore across directorships, the shareholders, and what I say is you sort of get to see how you get to know your customer better, the KYC aspect that you're all probably needing to look at times. So I won't go through the ASIC on file and current. I touched that on the first link. What I really want to do is dive into the data. And what we have is the known directorships. So this is a really key area that I've worked with Sally over the past 12 months. And what we've found is ASIC really need that director identifier number. And that's because over the many, many years they've been collecting director information, they've really muddled it up. So over time, we're hoping the DIN number will sort of help ASIC clean this enriched data up because they've got a lot of historical bits of information. And what the bureaus are doing is, because the ASIC extracts come from ASIC, they've already mixed up bits of director information within that. So when you're looking at it, we can say these are known directorships, and then further into that, we try to break down where there could be adverse in those other directorships. Now, key thing I like to point out is, even though we highlight it in red, it doesn't actually mean it's a bad thing. It's just anything that's happened within that office holder's history will be flagged within that. We've done a bit of development on the side. So when you get in here, we try to match known or current office holdings and then previous office holdings. Now, sometimes that information can be mixed up, and that's because if a company's been deregistered, the system's still recognizing them as an office holder, and until a refresh on a deregistered company takes place of ASIC, that information can be in the different boxes. But what we try to do here is also highlight defaults, court actions that have happened in other entities, so you know the difference between when a previous office holding has gone voluntary insolvency over an administration taking place. But long story short, you can jump into these credit files and go and explore that adverse. Again, this is where you can head down all the way down to ASIC information on that particular business. And then further on that, you can access some real historical information. So I really like to point this area out. And again, first link, I did mention that it leaves a historical footprint of these purchased ASIC extracts in the background. But why is it really important for you is that a lot of the time people have purchased a historical extract with that. So a historical extract took a picture of that company at that time, but it also provided previous office holders, you know, that timeline that I was talking about with the ASIC documents in there. So you can view that yourself. Costs nothing. You can jump in here, you can download it. But the key element is around that company office holders, where you can go here and take a look at when the previous director ceased. And then what we tend to find, particularly in insolvency, is a few directors have jumped off board maybe a few months or even a year or two before, and then it's been left with a new director. So you can really see when that changed and sort of the, you know, it could have been an acquisition of the business. So there's a number of things that the historical data can provide and really give you some good insights as part of it. Again, for those in this area, I'll do a lot more of a deeper dive into it, because it's some really complicated information, particularly when you're mixing in what I mentioned before, the name extracts, because ASIC's information is really muddled up with how they display that as part of it. So yeah, cross directorships offer a really great opportunity to understand their connections with other entities and really map out who you're dealing with as part of it. What I tend to then jump into is the shareholder, because that really relates to the director. And what I mean by that is, as you know, in your sector, there are elements to know your customer, do AML searches, PEP searches, all those sorts of things. Pull what we call the ultimate beneficiary reports. CreditorWatch offers you the opportunity to do that without needing to purchase reports. So you can actually take a look, and then if you go, hey, this is a really complicated business I'm dealing with, pull a UBO report. So it's really about giving you a bit more power back to understand where all this ASIC data is jumping from. I'm just going to jump into an example here where there's a bit more of a complex shareholder. And what we find, if I can find a bit more complicated one, is you'll then start to find the ultimate holdings of the company. So again, CreditorWatch being interactive means you don't go, all right, I know Langsky Holdings is the main ultimate beneficiary. What you can do is jump into that credit file and then take a further look. And what we find is that normally there can be telltale signs of indicators happening in other parts of their business, which is then bled onto the entity that you watch. So really, the opportunity here is to start digging out the background of not just the director, but the shareholders involved. What we find a lot of the time too is that it can relate to an international company, and then you're able to build that knowledge source back. I think a key feature is also just understanding the registered addresses. Again, they'll record very different ones with ASIC. You know, it might be their accountants as their registered office, but principal place of business can be different. So that's quite interactive to jump in there and take a further look. So ASIC documents, I really do hone in on this area, and that's because a lot of this data also impacts the credit rating. So we notice, you know, if companies start to change addresses or directors quite often, we all know these will have impacts on the algorithms of them as a business. So understanding a credit rating really comes from this area. And that's because over time, you'll start to actually be able to predict the credit rating because you'll see the behavioral changes within the form. So again, you can come to these areas and purchase reports and directly get those reports from ASIC, but you don't have to, and I think that's the key point. You can get a lot of information by just looking at the bureau itself as part of it. The reason I wanted to touch on this area is that we've seen a huge growth and change in what we call ASIC financial statement changes. So ASIC documents are lodged, and part of that is ASIC financials that are lodged every year. So this example I've got here is Porter Davis. What we're seeing out of trends is that companies might have reported within the last 12 months, but what they've done is really delayed their financials numbers. So in this case, Porter Davis submitted their required ASIC review on the 14th of June, but it was only up until June 2021. Now, had they stayed solvent at the moment, we would have been waiting for June this year for the next yearly ASIC financial and review. But what would have happened had we got to June is we would have had 2 years of not seeing their balance sheet. So we do a lot of work, and I work with someone who does financial analysis on finding these key components. But what I like to do is teach people to find this sort of stuff yourself. So there's no alerts on this. No one's going to say, hey, did you notice that someone delayed financials more than 6 months? What you're able to do is sort of take a look at this data and go, oh, hang on, it's quite interesting that they've delayed on financials, or they've delayed submitting this, or we know that they had an office holding change, but they didn't advise ASIC until later on. So it really allows you to sort of dig and see what's happening within those company structures to understand more. So financials, again, completely different cohort that we'll travel down. But yeah, I think it's some really interesting trends we're seeing out, because what I was talking about before, financial behavior really impacts on credit behavior because it's behavioral, and with the real big guys, they don't show signs of behavior until things are really bad. If you can get that insight into their financials much earlier, the credit file actually makes sense from that point when behavioral changes start to happen. So there's lagging indicators. You very likely won't be surprised because you've very early on in the piece understood that there were some issues within the business. And just to touch on those previous extracted data. So again, jump in here, it's really handy. It means you don't have to pull that extract every time. Someone could have potentially already done that. So I'll just use an example here. The last time this was extracted was on the 15th of May, and the previous person who pulled it purchased it on the 15th of May. Now, you know, historically, the information is not going to change, and you know that that information is up to date. So that is as good as purchasing a historical ASIC extract. It's all there. You can print that, download it, whatever you need. But ideally, you can generate it within your report, and yeah, build out your information through building a basic credit report. So last but certainly not least, one area, and I want to touch on this for everyone, but I'll dive much deeper into it for those that really need to know, is around that director information. And I've got a really good example of a company called Lloyd Constructions that went down recently. And what I've found in my research over the past 12 months is really needing to understand the director and how they've dealt with ASIC. So obviously here, Clinton Lloyd, he's got a number of adverse, he's linked to a number of companies. And what we found was that if I go to a little section here called Options Personal Name Extract, this looks at a database that ASIC have of registrations. So if I look at Clinton here, over the many years, he's created, or there have been 4 fields created as a director. Now, the defining difference is where he's put his birth location. So when it comes to a little bit of phoenixing or changing, you know, a little bit of heat from there, we've seen over the years people have created multiple names, or another classic one is maiden names. So you might have had a female director young, she's got married, and then that's changed her last name. You've got a couple of profiles. So this is the information we spend a bit of time getting people to understand, and that really ASIC themselves have sort of allowed this to snowball over the years with understanding what it is. So we'll do further information on this, but what happens is you can grab all those no name extracts, get a report, and what we've found is that you'll find companies that perhaps were deregistered many years ago, or there could be some active and they've been put under the different name ASIC extract. So for me, this is a really important area if you are investigating or doing a little bit of forensic accounting in understanding directors and sort of where they come from and what businesses they've been a part of over time. Otherwise, apart from that, I will share a link for something I did with James O'Donnell on our credit rating. It's called What Are You Rating For? And it will really jump in, and I'm quite excited about sharing for those who do care about the data some more insights, so you not only become an expert at reading credit reports, but you actually start to understand predictive behavior, and you'll get better at actually seeing risk before it's even come onto the credit report. So yeah, questions, please email, and we can follow up with further training. But for the time being, jump in, take a look, and I hope you find the information useful. Thank you.